Charles Gessert.
Earlier we plugged the planning meetings. Planning meetings are on the third Sunday. One of the advantages of coming to planning meetings is you get a little more variety in your speakers, so you don't have the same people coming up to the podium over and over again. So please come to the planning meetings with your ideas and your suggestions for speakers. Now today we're going to do something quite different. We're not going to have a lecture or a presentation. I'm not presenting. What I'd like to do is some work in engaging all of you in something that is preparatory for what we think will be a Lake Superior Freethinkers TED Talk that we will put together. Now, the TED Talk will be broadly on the question of where does morality come from? And we're going to be showing a brief film by Franz de Waal, who's a very well-known primatologist and sort of cultural anthropologist in a way, who looks at moral behavior in animals. And this hopefully will be interesting and will stimulate some thinking. What we're going to be doing then for the next half hour after that is hearing from you, how you react to the film and what your own thoughts are about where morality comes from. And just so you're thinking about this ahead of time, Bill's reflection was an excellent intro, but there are various views of where morality comes from. One of them, which I suspect Bill actually believes, is that humans are basically red of tooth and claw, and they are, survivors of a very, very brutal evolutionary process. And what we call morality would be a thin veneer which civilization places over our savage nature. And that's one view. By the way, that's a view that most religions do adhere to. They believe that you need the church to keep you from being a wild animal. The other view, broadly speaking, of course there's many views, but the other extreme view would be that morality is something that we have been selected for. Now that's many people might find that implausible, but we do have excellent evidence from evolution and the study of natural selection that surviving humans were not only selected for individual survival, but for group survival. There is that groups survived when they had the advantage of cooperation. And so there is probably, we think, hardwired into our genome some degree of affinity for cooperation. And that may then in turn lead to many, many modern expressions of what we call morality. Now, lest you think that a simple genetic preference could be the birthplace for a broad ethical code, I just want to point out a couple of things that are prepared, that evolution prepares us for, do not necessarily predict the modern uses of those same things. For example, the hand evolved in large part so that we would be safe in the trees, so we could climb and not fall. And yet today you can catch a pass or play the piano, you can write, you can type on a keyboard with that hand. In other words, the hand has evolved enormously sophisticated and varied uses that transcend its original evolutionary purpose. One of the big things that comes up often in religious discussions is that sexuality clearly evolved for procreation, but sexuality is a form of intimacy. Today it's used for all kinds of things, including selling cars and breakfast cereals. So the sexuality has a evolutionary purpose, but through the, if you will, evolution of society, it has had many, many other expressions. And I believe the same thing might be true of morality, and that's what we'll be examining today. In other words, it may come from some basic instincts which we inherit, but it may have evolved or changed or morphed or refined itself into what we now recognize as moral codes. So as you watch the film, be thinking of the following questions, or more importantly, be thinking of your answers to the following questions. What are the components of morality? Justice, kindness, what are the components of morality? Where does morality come from? Does it principally come from what we learn after we're born, or does it principally come from our nature? Or can we tell? I mean, it's a very difficult question. What morality, if any, would survive privation? In other words, what we recognize as human morality, would it entirely go away if you were imprisoned or were starving? What degree of morality would survive privation? Where does cruelty come from? These are all interesting questions that pertain to our question of what constitutes our morality. So with that, Tom, if you could help us see the film. By the way, the film is also, the work of Franz de Waal is also captured very well in this book, The Bonobo and the Atheist. It's a modern book, so it's just from the last year or two, and it's a book I highly recommend. There's a lot of stimulating thought in the book. Well, I'll be asking for your reactions to these ideas, but out of fairness to Jim Little, I have to say that Jim has pointed out that the film is like a cartoon. It's really presenting these things in an entertaining but relatively superficial level. And what we're really interested in is the degree to which we recognize or embrace the themes that he has that are beneath the surface. It's not the exact examples, because we can pick those apart pretty well. So let's turn it over to you. And one of the things is that we're going to be trying to learn from you, and so we're going to Jan is going to put the camera on you, and we want you to use the microphone. So. David Cole.
Thank you. So I'm interested in the connection between evolution and morality also. And there's, it looks as though, you mentioned it actually in your preparatory remarks, that you can think of cultural evolution and biological evolution for social animals are in the same business. They need to come up with behavioral rules or behavioral patterns that lead to cooperation. But there's a dilemma for us because we also want to continue to exist ourselves. So we don't want to give up everything for the group. We want to make, say, do reciprocity, where I'll scratch your back if I have a guarantee that you'll scratch my back. So it looks as though they might both be in the same business. That doesn't mean that one comes from the other. So you don't get the cultural evolution of moral rules doesn't need to come from a biological basis other than the ability to act on rules. But there's a standard objection to looking to evolution for morality, and that's called the naturalistic fallacy that we have to at least keep in mind. And the idea here is that whatever is evolved is, that's the way we're inclined to behave. But morality is about what is good, or what we ought to do, not what we do, but what we should be doing. And sometimes that will be something completely different than our evolved inclinations. Other times it might be similar to it. So the objection is you can never get morality from a science, a descriptive science, because it only gives you descriptions of the way we behave and maybe explanations, but it doesn't tell you how we ought to behave. You can't get ought from is the human claim.
First of all, I'd like to say that, I don't know whether David, whether you've read the book or not, but you would find an agreement with a lot of what he has to say. He says in part that no matter how much science you study, you're never going to get a moral code out of it. Because all that science is going to give you is some evidence of various instincts. Another book, though, I would really recommend is The World Until Yesterday by Jared Diamond. And I just finished it recently. And in there he says that the principal purposes of our, if you will, rules or moral codes is so that strangers can live together. As our populations have increased and our economics have changed, we've had to interact with strangers. And that until 100,000 years ago, that interaction was really primarily red of tooth and claw. I mean, you really were anticipating that any stranger would be an enemy. And that the rules, which have evolved very recently, are to deal with that. And they are only based on some instincts. Let's get other comments. Way in the back.
What I was seeing was unity versus inequality. And in a significant study, the countries that had high unity and high unity and low inequality were Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. The countries that had high inequality and low unity were Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Turkey, and the United States. And for high unity and high inequality, it was absolutely zero.
Again, I'm mentioning the book by Jerry Diamond. One of his major points would reinforce what you're saying. He concludes that one of the things that marks a modern society is the abolishment of private violence, and that the state has a monopoly on violence. Well, that means the state can execute people, it can conduct wars, it has police forces, it has criminal courts, and there's all kinds of things that exert violence, but it's a monopoly. We don't have private violence. Well, how is that brought about? It's brought about because there's a large shared understanding that I'm not going to shoot my neighbor, I'm going to call the police. It's really the cooperative societies, the societies that have a large investment in the commons, that can actually bring off a shared understanding that private violence is no longer permitted. Other comments?
She said that's unity. By the way, I want to let people know you keep 4 or 5 inches between the mic and your mouth. You get so close it gets pounded.
There's the idea that more equal societies do better. And there's a book entitled More Equal Societies Do Better. And this is derived, I think, partly as a study from what WHO calls the social determinants of health. And it points out that more healthy groups or individuals have better life chances and so on. And going back, of course, to the idea of more equal societies, they often do quote the Scandinavian sort of models versus Brazil and places like that. And there's various ways of working out, are they Q scores? How equal societies are in terms of the different proportions of societies that have of members of society that have things like how many people have access to safe water, how many people have safe housing or good health or whatever.
Don't give up the microphone just yet. I'd like to ask you, and I probably should have asked our other speaker, where do you think that comes from? And that's really what we're interested in today is, what are your thoughts about where that equal society came from?
I think it's because you have, I mean, if you, I don't know, I hate that word, but you have you have or you learn that you're not, every man is not an island, that you're living in a society. I mean, this was the big thing that people used to criticize Maggie Thatcher about. She said, people used to say Maggie Thatcher has no concept of the value of a society. She said this is solely on the individual, and you can't do that.
You use the phrase, you're not an island, but it's very interesting, and perhaps as our discussion goes on, people could address this. Why are we not islands? I mean, very, very basic understanding of Darwin, if you only go to natural selection at the individual level, would suggest that we are each in it for ourselves. But there's something that we instinctively say we're not really islands, but I don't know where that comes from. Other comments?
I was raising my hand.
I have 3 comments before I kind of have my opinion, but I think it's interesting that all the talk has been couched under the terms of morality, and I haven't heard anybody talk about altruism. And morality is a human construct. Altruism is, in my opinion, when any organism, animal, fish, whatever, acts in a manner that is beyond just themselves. So morality would be like the human version of altruism, and I'm never not fascinated by this anthropocentric views. Everything is only human until science proves otherwise. It's just endlessly fascinating to me. Only humans have souls. Then you made a comment about imprisoned individuals. I have a close relative who's just gotten halfway through a 40 to life shot, and I can tell you that they have moral codes there. They're different. And to compare the moral code of in a state or federal incarceration to out here is kind of absurd, because it's like comparing apples to oranges, but they exist. There's predators there, and there's people who just want to do the right thing while they're there. And then there's the people that are going to be there for the rest of their lives. And I don't know exactly how to say this part without getting emotional, but the idea that civilized societies don't have private violence is just an absolutely absurd thing to say on its face. There's violence everywhere. Just because it's not seen or it's not acknowledged is just not true. Just because there's a facade of everybody getting along doesn't mean that people don't beat the crap out of each other when they're not with the rest of their social primates. And I'm speaking from a very emotional place, but, to say that people call the police, it's just such a huge generalization. That's a strictly personal disagreement. As far as the other stuff, does it always have to be nature versus nurture? How about it's just a combination that we just can't even understand how complicated the interactions are? And one last thing, I think the bonobos have, is it bonobo or bonobo?
Bonobo.
Okay, I think they have the right idea. I'm convinced if people fucked more, they'd fight less.
Well, thank you for the comments. Just a couple of reactions. One is that I didn't mean to suggest that the abolition of private violence has been anywhere near successful or evenly distributed or anything like that. It's only been adopted as an ideal, but most states, most modern states, attempt to reduce or abolish private violence. We make domestic violence, at least has a criminal code associated with it. Now, in reference
So
to...
the theory behind the criminal code of IPV versus the reality of when it gets brought into court are two different things.
Yeah. Now, you're mentioning altruism is very important. One of the things I did in looking at these subject matter we're talking about today is I went online and looked at the components of morality, and altruism comes up all the time. That it is seen as an indicator or a measure or a yardstick, if you will, for a moral behavior. And you just think of all the things that we do as humans that are not rewarded by evolution. For example, caring for adopted children, caring for pets, all kinds of things that we do that are essentially have no evolutionary benefit.
Well, we're we're social primates, so adoption would inherently be better for the entire species, because if we're willing to take care of other people's kids, and that's, I mean, social primates take care of other people's kids, whether it's on a permanent basis in the form of adoption or a temporary basis while some of the adults go out and do other activities.
Yes, very.
That's altruism and we call it moral because we're humans and we're thinking about it, so let's label that moral.
Well, you're quite correct, and you and Franz de Waal would agree with each other. He cites any number of examples of primates, non-human primates, doing that exact thing, adopting animals within their clan.
And some, you know, the things that are selected for under evolution change with the circumstances. If the circumstances favor seeing beyond your own individual needs and looking for the greater good, that's going to be selected for.
Yeah.
If the circumstances change such that taking care of yourself is what is required to survive, then that's going to be selected for.
Next, who has the...
Right.
There we go.
In our discussion, I think we have to take into account genocide, the Holocaust, dehumanizing the Jews, and in the state of Minnesota, the territory of Minnesota, dehumanizing the Indians before 1850. We are guilty, we white folk. We have, and the Germans, of course, are terribly guilty. We have to take this into account in this whole discussion.
So, but before you give up the microphone, tell me, are you basically saying that the moral codes we have are a thin veneer on a savage nature? I mean, is that your view?
They are codes for white folk, not for the other. They don't, for the other, they don't work.
Just a quick challenge for you. I am reading Stilwell and the American Experience in China, and and the author, Barbara Tuchman, recounts over 20 pages the savagery of the Japanese toward the Chinese in Nanking and everywhere else. And so I would like to just challenge you a little bit about the implicit racial preference for white people having a monopoly on cruelty.
Well, I'm a follower of Edward Said, Orientalism, and state policy of Britain and France and so on against the Asians in India and elsewhere proves pretty well Edward Said's correction. The other is there. And in the German case, it was the Jews were the other, even though they were the core of German thought. We can't, books and books and books coming out trying to explain the genocide, but why, how it happened. Prussia in the 19th century was tolerant of Jews. And how this happened, obviously Versailles, Woodrow Wilson, our own hero, leading to that. We could be driven to genocide.
One of the measures of the progress of civilization that's pointed to by authors like Jared Diamond is the expansion of the pool of people that we consider our people. In other words, it starts at the village level, and eventually it becomes a tribe, and eventually it becomes a nation or a race. And we are at a stage now when I think that we might be toying with the idea that it's not limited, Chris, you'll like this, not limited by being human, that we are related closely to other animals. And in other words, when you point to the Holocaust and the other tragedies, those are obvious failures of empathy. They're terrible failures of recognition that we're all in the same pool together. But the general trend of history seems to be an expansion of the horizons of what constitutes us. Us, half of you in the room here are strangers to me, and yet you're all us. We're all in something together and doing something together.
Yeah, but since the basis of all morality does seem to be genetic in nature, it depends, since group survival is essential. It depends upon, as you were just mentioning, what group you define yourself to be. We will be moral within the group, and we can define the other group as nips and boots and Jews and whatever we want. They're not us. So we can destroy them. It's not a specific anyone's culture. I think that's part of the human makeup. So whether we can make that transition to that larger group and see us all one part of humanity, I personally am doubtful, because we have to have something that will connect us. I mean, and the humanity thing is, we have evolved, my group fighting your group for dominance. Can we make that transition? I don't see it. I think it's larger now, but yet all we have to do is be pressured, and we revert back to our old selves.
Well, you know, in these various readings I've done about this, one of the things that is pointed to over and over again is that the cohesion of large groups is extremely difficult. And large groups have often been helped by particularly religion and national identity. So patriotism and religion have stepped in to create larger group cohesion. For example, I could not tell the difference between a Shiite and a Sunni, but there's large in-group cohesion within the Sunnis and within the Shiites. They regard each other as enemies. I can't tell the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant Irishman, and yet there's large cohesion within the groups. And so religion and patriotism or nationalism have served to create, if you will, artificial cohesion. And it is effective. It ends up in what Sheldon was pointing out. You end up with this terrible atrocities that occur when it is mobilized in the service of a horrific ambition of some kind. David,
I think that if you look at the history of ethics, if they're thinking about ethics, this interest in altruism is quite recent. That the traditions in ethics don't have much to do with altruism at all. There's this Kantian doctrine of categorical imperative and respect for others. But before that, there's codes like the Ten Commandments or Sharia law. And if you look through those things, altruism plays a very small role. It's mostly thou shalt not and thou shalt not and so forth, or you need to give what's due to God. There's a paradox in thinking of altruism as having a biological basis that I know you're familiar with. And that is, so biologists try to precise the definition of altruism. It's not just doing nice things, but it's doing nice things that have a cost to your own biological fitness. That is to say, reduce your own ability to send your genes forth into the future. And the idea is that cannot arise, that the problem is that if somebody has genes that predispose them to altruism, their line will become extinct. The group will take advantage of that, send them off to war, send them off to go buy their place and get the food, send them off to do flood relief. And all the others who do not have these altruistic promoting genes will flourish at the expense of the altruists. And in any you can do this with computer models of artificial organisms that have this kind of behavior. They disappear. So there is this problem. And so at least in biology or biologically based thinking about morality, this view that there is this kind of tendency to favor the greater good of the group is very suspicious, because they don't think that kind of tendency can flourish biologically.
I think that we have a comment here, but I think that one way we might summarize that, I don't know, that altruism may be a recent, evolutionarily speaking, or maybe even an epiphenomena that's not part of evolution per se, but something that we experience in some forms of modern society. I might say, by the way, in response to one thing Chris brought up earlier, is that within prison systems, we certainly see various kinds of characteristics that we would regard as components of morality in strong operation. For example, loyalty within group. If you are adherent to a group, you will be protected. And if you're not part of a group, if you're isolated, I have a couple others, Chris, and then we'll get you in a minute. So Brian, you've got a comment.
There's so much I can comment on. I'm not sure where to start. Now, first of all, you say altruism is fairly recent. So what do you mean by recent? Like, when did you consider the rise of altruism?
It's not the rise of altruism, it's the rise of interest in altruism in ethical theory.
And when is that?
200 years.
20th century.
Okay, well, let me see here. It seems to me that, where is it? You didn't, you mentioned Epicurus. He said, we were impressed by how ahead of his time he was with his thinking, how he said that, the ultimate, the reason for human existence is to increase pleasure and reduce suffering. Isn't that kind of altruism based on some? Isn't that? It's like reciprocal altruism. That's what I'm thinking of. Because
That's not the problematic part. The reciprocal altruism is in my own best interest, but it's altruism where I am self-sacrificing literally, that looks like it couldn't survive or couldn't flourish in a Darwinian population.
Okay. I've got a book I'd like to share with everyone, right, thinking of this. It's called Mother Nature is Trying to Kill You by Dan Riskin. He's a biologist, and this whole book is essentially about, he's investigating whether true altruism exists in nature and indeed in humanity. And he comes to the conclusion that it doesn't. But essentially he says that reciprocal altruism, it's difficult to summarize it, but he said essentially he suggested it's as good as true altruism. Just because it benefits us doesn't mean it's not morally. I'm butchering this explanation, but let me see. But I just highly recommend it. It's an excellent. It really goes into morality and evolution and how the latter shapes the former. And I know I've talked before about reciprocal altruism in vampire bats, right?
Yes.
Okay, so do I need to, would anyone like me to repeat that, or should I move on?
You move on, because we've got...
Okay. Well, another thing I think I'd like to mention is, Chris brought this up, the issue of privilege in, I don't know if you mentioned the word, but the privilege is a big issue in, the morality of societies, because, some people are inherently more privileged than others, like say, their ancestors weren't oppressed and enslaved for hundreds of years beforehand. They were not the victims of genocide beforehand. They are not, we have, let me see, think about,
Well, Brian, let me ask you a question. I think that what I hear you coming up with in a moment is that certain types of moral behavior that we all recognize and applaud are actually luxuries, and they occur primarily, or they're easiest to witness, within populations that have enough privilege and enough luxury to be able to behave morally, and that would then, set up a situation in which people that have not been enjoying those privileges might have a different codes of behavior because they've had to evolve different ways to survive.
Yeah. Now, here's an example. You mentioned people call the police if a crime is committed and the police come and they arrest the person who committed the crime. Well, there's a massive injustice in our what would you call it? Not private. The state, the law enforcement, because for example, one of the people of color, namely black people, they often do not want to call the police, and do not want people calling the police if they are involved in some kind of altercation, because the police have a very bad habit of just killing black people on sight. There was a case of a black woman who had an invader in her house. She called the police, and she grabbed a knife to defend herself. Police came in, they saw her with a knife, and they just shot her.
I think that's all I have to say.
Well, John, just a quick comment would be that much of what you said could be repackaged and relabeled as contributing toward cooperation within a group. You're going to produce better if you have good relationships with your neighbors. Those kinds of things, maybe some people would label those as group selective factors, and others would just, as you do, label them primarily as individual selective factors. But the point is, we're pointing to the same pressures within evolution that would lead to different types of instincts.
Okay, one other thing that I would like to comment on, and then I'll pass the mic over here, is that we all understand, I think, the evolutionary origins of us and them, how advantageous it has been in our primate past to distinguish between our group and others, and to reject the others and support our own groups as, hunter-gatherers and that kind of thing. It's perfectly obvious that us and them is a useful, adaptive response. Now, of course, we have to fight that, and sometimes we're not very successful.
Well, we pass the microphone over to Chris, who's been dying to make another comment. And as you're doing that, I'll just point out that the Swedes and the Finns used to kill each other regularly. The Danes and the Norwegians used to kill each other regularly. And we've gotten a little higher. So now the Scandinavians hang together. So the group identity changes over time.
Well,
As usual, John sums up everything very nicely. The reason I got so excited was the comments that I had dovetail very nicely after he said it. And I wanted to reiterate the altruism versus morality thing. I think I don't want to put words in the other fellow's mouth, but altruism is the doing things for the greater good at the expense of the single organism. But that doesn't, I think he takes the extreme version of doing it to the point where you die, and that's not always the case. You don't have to die to be altruistic, but you do a little bit of self-sacrifice. And I'm not sure what models he's talking about, but the models where those traits get selected out, I haven't seen these models, maybe it's just a bad model. Weather modeling has come a long way in the past 50 years. We can do 10-day forecasts now because the models are better. So I am not convinced that any altruistic tendencies will be selected out. And what I said was was wonky and scientific, and John said basically what I said in more layman's terms. Depending on the situation, altruism may be selected for. Up until we started doing nation states, the us versus them was more successful. And as we become one humanistic group, the criteria to select for success changes. Evolution doesn't have a direction. And if the criteria change, then the traits that are selected for will change.
One of the things that, first of all, we usually run till about 11:15, which is right about now, but we're going to run over a few minutes. One of the things I'd like to say that is great about modern morality, if you will, is tolerance of diversity. Within our group, we have enormous diversity of opinion, enormous diversity of ideas and backgrounds, and that is part of our strength. is bringing out these different ideas and different perspectives when we're looking at the same object but seeing different things.
Anybody here familiar with the group, it's the alter, you mentioned it, it's a group of people that are altruistic. Altrusa? Any group, any members here from an altruistic group? The difference between altruism is basically looking for similarities within our group or with other groups. Intolerance is looking at the differences. And when we speak of ours or us and them, when we refer to us, we're looking for similarities. When we refer to them, we're looking at differences or for differences.
It's in our linguistics. Hey, I have a little, can I talk to you when I'm doing this?
You're allowed to speak, Bill.
Years ago, I saw an interview on TV, and it was a guy who stopped on a highway and prevented another person from committing suicide by jumping off a bridge. Right? So, and it always stuck with my mind because the guy who prevented the suicide almost blocked. He grabbed the guy, and then he partially went over himself, and then other people had to stop and help him get there. He was kind of in between. I imagine if that had gone on a long time, he would have had to let go, maybe. I don't know. But anyway, as I thought about it over the years, I thought, well, these are two people that are pretty similar. The guy that was going to commit suicide and the guy that stopped on the highway. And that would have been what I would call a reflective reaction. Like we're having time now to think about it. That would have been a reaction time.
Reflexive.
Yeah, reflexive reaction. Okay, so you just grabbed him. All of a sudden he was in this situation. So you wonder what was going on in his brain. But I often thought later, now, what if the person that was about to commit suicide was wearing a turban? Okay. Well, what if they had a little darker skin? What if they were babbling in some other
What
language?
if the guy who stopped the car was burning? Same thing.
So what if the differences in the two people that had that interaction that day had some obvious things how we define each other? The reflexive action, I think, would have slowed down to a reflective action, and I think there would have been a suicide that day. That's the way I see it. So this thing about trying to include everybody in our altruism, I think we're moving in that direction. But that's how I interpret it right now. When you have to make a big decision real fast, like shooting somebody because they're holding a knife. If the guy holding the knife had a sweater on and was white, I don't think he would have been dead that day.
I appreciate all that. I guess I'm just a basic person. I looked at the TED Talk and it gives me a couple of pillars that define morality to a certain extent. And it appears that there's some innate stuff that occurred amongst other animals besides us that indicates that we have some basis for how we behave. And August Berkshire I went to a talk he talked about mirror neurons that have to do with empathy, that help us appreciate what other people are feeling. And to me, what I get out of this is that, yes, there is innate stuff that makes a basis for morality, and there will be an ongoing battle between reality and morality that will continue. And we've reached, I think, a fairly precipitous point with the environment, where we have this moral, for any other lack of a term, some moral altruism about morality that is now in a direct conflict with the reality of dealing with the issue. And we look at, from an economic standpoint, we look at trans-globalism, or globalism as that a positive thing from an altruistic standpoint or a moral standpoint. and then it headbutts in with nationalism that we see in this country and across the world. So I guess when I got a whole thing, I gotta go back to the same thing. I believe from this and that there is a genetic basis for how we act morally, and that will probably continue to headbutt with the reality of living with society and cooperation and our group versus their group, and I think you can create conflict. There was a classic experiment done where they took the two college kids, and they made half a dozen of them guards, and they made half a dozen of them prisoners, and they watched what happened. Or the guy that had the shock system that said, if they do this, shock them. If they do, even if there was, no shock, that they would do what they in a certain situation. So I think you can create a situation that will get some really nasty behavior. I think Mark Twain said, it takes good people to do good things, takes bad people to do bad things, takes religions to have good people do bad things.
I think that we should declare victory.
Yeah.
We've run a little bit late, and Chris, I know you have more comments. There we go, one more, there we go.
Thank you. In my personal opinion, all of this boils down to one phrase that I've always grown up with. Simple minds have simple pleasures. What it means to me is humans try to itemize everything that ever happens to us, to others, so we can actually feel superior. We don't. We're not superior. We are just part of a chain.
Thank you. And in sort of drawing to a conclusion or close, first of all, I say we've had a lot of rich comments. They'll be on film. We'll get, we got one more mic here. One more comment.
Jerry.
Yeah,
We're going to wrap up shortly, so go ahead, Jerry.
yeah. Every time that an idea is expressed, I sort of ask myself, can I take that idea and use it as a stepping stone to move forward or to understand something? And all of the ideas that were suggested today and posed today bring me to a dilemma that I continue to have. It's a personal dilemma, and I think it's a dilemma that faces society. And that is, how do we bridge that gap with the person that I think is evil, that is negative, that happens to possess what I call the mean gene? And I don't know. I don't know how to do that. But I want to learn how to do that. I want to figure out what it is that I need to do and learn to do it and learn to have the feelings that will enable me to sit down with a person that I absolutely don't even want to talk to because I think that they are on the wrong side. And I don't, I'd like to try to formulate what the theory is or what a formula might be to start to pick away at how to get beyond my own negative feelings for that person that I really don't want to talk to because they are, and they're not the other. They're not the person of color. They're not the person of poverty. They're not the person. They're the person that. I use this simple example, and it's really how we done. I say if there's 10 people picked at random, and I have 2 questions for the 10 people. First question is simply, how many of you want to take part of your money to educate their own kids in the public school system, all 10 of them will step forward. I believe all 10 of them will step forward. Next question is, how many of you will take some of your money to educate your neighbor? All of a sudden, the number that step forward is different. I think that's the problem.
Okay, I think we will wrap it up, and I would like to give you a happy thought to go home with. As you're getting in your car and thinking about your own activities, we have in the world, not just the U.S., in the world, we have a vast environmental movement. People are concerned about the environment. What's that all about? The environment that's going to collapse is going to be beyond most of our lifetimes. We're actually doing something for people we don't know, people we will never know, people we are not necessarily related to, animal species we are not related to. What's that all about? What motivates that? That's an interesting question. And thank you.